On most bases, people noticed the loud ones, the ones who strutted in the uniform, chest puffed, stories spilling like gunfire at the mess hall tables. But her? She was the type that blended into the concrete walls and the endless blur of machinery. She wasn't the one who caught eyes when she walked through the hangar or the Combs Bay. And yet, every day, whether anyone noticed or not, she carried with her a quiet power, the ability to connect voices across oceans, across skies, across the chaos of battle. Her name rarely came up in conversation outside the tight circle of communication specialists. Some referred to her as the Combs Girl. Others didn't even know her name, only that if a radio failed, she'd appear with a weathered olive-drab toolbox, a roll of tape clipped to her belt, and that faint smell of solder that clung to her hands like a second skin. She was small in stature, soft-spoken, and careful in everything she did. But behind the reserved demeanor was a mind trained for detail and precision skills more crucial than most realized. On the Navy base, communications gear was lifeblood. Radios didn't just carry words. They carried survival. A misheard order, a garbled frequency, a failed transmitter, those things could mean helicopters circling in the wrong valley, convoys walking into ambushes, or extraction teams missing their pickup. For the SEALs especially, clarity was everything. They didn't have the luxury of second chances. And that's why she worked the way she did, methodically, deliberately, as if every wire she touched carried the weight of men's lives. She wasn't adorned with combat ribbons, nor had she ever fired a weapon in anger. Yet she understood something very few cared to acknowledge. Without the silent hands behind the scenes, even the fiercest fighters would stand deaf in the dark. Every morning began the same. She'd arrive early, slipping through the bay doors before most of the crews were awake. She liked the quiet hours when the base still yawned itself awake, when the hum of the fluorescent lights was the only sound. She'd unpack her tools, line them in order, and start with the gear check. Headsets, field radios, long-range SATCOM units one by one. She tested them against the baseline frequencies. It wasn't glamorous work. There were no parades, no war stories attached to replacing a cracked fuse or a fried circuit board. But she took pride in catching things others missed. A faint distortion in the channel. A battery pack that drained 2% too fast. She noticed the small details before they became failures. It was her invisible armor for the operators who trusted their gear without ever thinking about it. She remembered once watching a SEAL platoon return from an exercise. Their faces were streaked with mud, gear slung heavy on their backs. They looked like walking war itself. She stood aside, unnoticed, as they passed, but one of them unknowingly carried a radio she had repaired just hours before. It worked flawlessly during their entire operation. She didn't need him to know her name. The simple fact that he walked back safe, mission intact, was enough. What most didn't realize was that her path into the Navy hadn't been accidental. Growing up, she had been fascinated by machines. Radios especially. Her father, a volunteer firefighter, had an old scanner in the living room, and as a child she'd sit cross-legged on the carpet, listening to bursts of static, followed by voices calling codes. It seemed like magic voices traveling unseen through the air, carrying urgency, coordination, and connection. When she enlisted, she knew exactly what she wanted, to be the person who made sure those invisible threads never broke. Still, despite her skill, she often felt invisible. In a world where physical toughness was currency, her role felt almost hidden in the shadows. She didn't complain it wasn't her way, but sometimes, late at night, she wondered if anyone really saw her. Did anyone notice the hours she put in? The quiet sacrifices? The pressure of knowing that a single mistake could ripple into disaster for people she'd never meet? Her fellow technicians admired her work ethic, though. They often joked she was married to her toolbox. She could sit for hours bent over a fried circuit board, eyes squinting under the magnifying lamp, until the last trace of the problem was gone. She never rushed, even when the deadlines loomed. In her mind, haste was the enemy of reliability. Better to lose a few hours than risk a failed connection in the middle of a mission. There were times she felt the gulf between herself and the SEALs. They moved in packs, exuding confidence, their camaraderie loud and unbreakable. She worked in silence, often alone, but she never envied their place. She knew her role. She wasn't meant to storm beaches or breach doors. She was the one who made sure that when they called for support, for air cover, for medevac, someone heard them. And that mattered. That was her war. Even so, she couldn't deny the strange pride that stirred inside her when SEALs walked into the bay. They didn't usually notice the Kung's team operators, tended to take their gear for granted, but she'd catch glimpses of appreciation in subtle ways. A nod, a short, gruff, thanks. To her, that was gold. Respect from warriors didn't come cheap. She had been on base long enough to understand one unspoken truth. Recognition rarely came to people like her. And that was fine. She wasn't in it for glory. But part of her still longed for someone, someday, to understand the weight she carried. Not just the tools, not just the gear, but the responsibility that stretched unseen between missions and lives. Her hands bore the marks of her trade tiny burns from soldering irons, faint scars from wire cutters slipping, calluses on her palms. These were her battle wounds, invisible to most. She wore them with quiet pride. No one pinned ribbons for late nights fixing encryption modules, but she knew her worth. She carried it inside where no one could strip it away. That evening, as the sun sank low and the base buzzed with the noise of drills and preparations, she packed her gear into the battered metal case she carried everywhere. She didn't know yet that tonight would change something. She didn't know yet that her quiet existence, her behind-the-scenes work, would suddenly be pulled into the light in a way that left hardened men silent. For now, she remained what she had always been, the quiet specialist. Steady, unnoticed, reliable. And yet, fate had a way of taking the unseen and placing it squarely in the center of the stage. All it took was one broken radio, one mission-critical failure, and one moment where the invisible hands of a quiet technician proved louder than the roar of any battle. The sun had just dipped beyond the horizon, leaving streaks of orange bleeding into purple across the sky. Floodlights clicked on around the Navy base, washing the yard and hangars in harsh white glow. For most personnel, it was just another evening. For one group, however, tonight was no ordinary night. Inside a reinforced operations room, a SEAL platoon was gearing up for a high-level training exercise. The mission wasn't live combat, but it was close designed to simulate the exact stress, timing, and coordination they would face overseas. Everything had to run flawlessly. Aircraft offshore were on standby, fast boats prepped at the pier, and remote surveillance teams locked into position. All of it depended on one fragile lifeline: communications. The men moved with the same precision as a clock's gears, each checking weapons, tightening straps, loading magazines, and slinging radios over shoulders. The low murmur of voices mixed with the metallic clatter of equipment. For them, this wasn't a game. Training was life. Training was survival. And then, as the lieutenant ordered a final comms check, it happened. Static. One of the long-range encrypted radios, the one assigned to the team's point man, went dead, mid-transmission. The green light blinked weakly, then died altogether. The room froze for a beat. The lieutenant's jaw tightened. Run it again. The operator fiddled with the set, tapped the side, adjusted the frequency. Nothing. A harsh burst of static hissed, and silence. In the language of soldiers, silence was the enemy. The lieutenant looked at the clock on the wall. In less than 30 minutes, the drill had to launch. The aircraft wouldn't wait. The boats wouldn't wait. And without that radio, the entire exercise was compromised. One broken box had the power to collapse weeks of preparation. The platoon's senior chief swore under his breath. "This is mission critical, sir. We can't push out blind." The lieutenant didn't argue. He knew it was true. One of the younger SEALs muttered, "Can't we swap units?" "No spares," the chief replied. This was it. Frustration pulsed through the room like static. SEALs weren't accustomed to waiting. Their world was action, momentum, resolve. But tonight, they were shackled by a dead circuit board. And that's when someone mentioned her. "The comms tech," a petty officer said quietly. "She's still on shift. Get her down here." The chief nodded, already reaching for the phone. Within minutes, a runner was sent across the base. She was in the maintenance bay when the call came. Bent over a headset with a fried receiver, she worked beneath the glow of her lamp, magnifying lens balanced in front of her. The faint scent of melted solder hung in the air. She was in her element, quiet, focused, alone. The knock at the door startled her. "Specialist, the SEALs need you." "Now," she blinked. It wasn't unusual to be called last minute, but the tone in the runner's voice was sharp, urgent. She wiped her hands on a rag, closed her kit, and followed. Her boots echoed across the concrete as she hurried toward the operations room. When she stepped inside, the atmosphere hit her like a wall. The SEALs stood in full gear, vests strapped tight, helmets clipped, weapons ready. Their faces were hard, eyes sharp. She felt instantly smaller, like she had intruded into a world where she didn't belong. But all eyes turned toward her, and suddenly, the weight of the room settled squarely on her shoulders. The lieutenant pointed at the dead radio. "It failed during the check. We've got 20 minutes. Can you fix it?" The words weren't angry, but they carried the full force of urgency. She set her kit on the table, flipped open the latches, and pulled the unit close. Her heart raced. These weren't fellow technicians watching her. They were Navy SEALs, men known for impossible missions and uncheckable standards. Their silence was louder than shouting. She swallowed and steadied her hands. "I'll do what I can, sir." As she opened the casing, she could feel their eyes drilling into her back. They weren't trying to intimidate her. They simply had no time to waste. But the effect was the same. Every move she made felt magnified, critical. Her fingers worked with careful speed, unscrewing the panel, exposing the guts of the device. She recognized the model instantly. Old, reliable, but prone to overheating when pushed. She checked the power module fine, the antenna circuit intact. Then she saw it, a scorched section of the frequency board, tiny but fatal. Her tools clicked against the table as she pulled out the soldering iron. She moved quickly, stripping wires, bridging the gap, recalibrating the frequency alignment. Sweat beaded her forehead, not just from the heat of the iron, but from the silence pressing down around her. The SEALs didn't fidget, didn't chatter. They just stood, watching. It was like performing surgery with an audience of warriors who had no tolerance for failure. The lieutenant finally spoke. "How long?" She didn't look up. 10 minutes. Maybe less. He gave a single nod as if that settled it. Minutes crawled. She soldered the last joint, replaced the panel, and reset the device. Her fingers danced across the dials, bringing the unit back online. A low hum filled the air, followed by a burst of static, then silence. Everyone leaned closer. She adjusted the frequency, fine-tuned the alignment, and pressed the transmit key. "Comms check," she said quietly into the headset. The response came instantly. A sharp, crystal-clear voice rang out across the channel. "Solid copy. Receiving you 5 by 5. The radio's green light glowed steady. She exhaled slowly, tension draining from her shoulders. It worked. The room shifted. The seals didn't cheer. They weren't the type. But the nods, the faintest of smirks, the release of breath, they were as loud as applause in that world. The lieutenant stepped forward, lifted the unit, and handed it to his operator. His eyes met hers for a fraction of a second, and though his face was unreadable, the message was clear. She had just saved their mission. She closed her kit, trying to fade back into the background. But the truth was undeniable. She had been the pivot point of the night. Without her, the mission would have collapsed before it began. With her, they moved forward. And as she stepped out of the room, the thought struck her with quiet force. She had just been tested in the most unforgiving of arenas. Not with bullets or fire, but with silence, scrutiny, and the weight of a mission's success. And she had not failed. The operations room was never meant to feel like a battlefield, yet to her, it suddenly did. The air was charged, thick with tension that clung to her skin. The hum of fluorescent lights overhead seemed louder than usual, almost mocking. Every second ticked away like a countdown, and though no gunfire rang out, the silence of the SEALs pressed harder than any chaos she'd ever known. She was seated at the table, hunched over the disassembled radio, her toolkit spread like the instruments of a surgeon. Around her, 12 men stood in full combat gear, vests strapped, helmets clipped, rifles slung across shoulders. Their presence filled the room, walls seeming to shrink in. These were men bred for pressure, warriors molded by fire. And now, for the briefest moment, they were powerless, waiting on her. It was a strange reversal. She, the quiet specialist who usually slipped unnoticed through the corridors, had become the center of gravity. The mission clock was ticking, and the fate of their exercise, and their pride, sat in pieces on the table in front of her. Her fingers moved carefully over the exposed circuitry. She had diagnosed the problem quickly, but repair under scrutiny was another beast entirely. Alone in her shop, she worked with rhythm, humming to herself, the world narrowed to wires and solder. Here, though, the atmosphere stripped away comfort. Every adjustment echoed in her ears. Every click of a tool reverberated in the silence. The lieutenant stood closest, arms crossed, expression unreadable. His eyes, sharp as steel, tracked her movements. He wasn't impatient. He knew pressure when to apply, and when not to, but his presence was weight enough. Behind him, the other SEALs whispered among themselves, their voices low, clipped, carrying that rough edge of men who had no tolerance for failure. She forced herself to breathe slowly. Her instructors had taught her long ago, machines don't care if you're nervous. Circuits didn't respond to sweat. Wires didn't tremble with fear. They obeyed logic. If she stayed true to that, she'd be fine. Still, her hands betrayed her, the faintest tremor running through her fingertips as she adjusted a coil. In her head, she replayed the stakes. If she failed, the SEALs wouldn't launch. The aircraft offshore would return empty, the boats at the pier would be stood down, and weeks of planning would dissolve. She wasn't just fixing a radio. She was holding together the seams of an entire operation. Her throat tightened. She pushed the thought away. Focus. The iron hissed as it touched the board, releasing a curl of smoke. She soldered the replacement joint carefully, steadying her breathing with each movement. She could feel sweat bead at her temples, running down beneath the collar of her uniform. She wanted to wipe it away, but she didn't dare lift her hands from the board. One of the SEALs shifted his weight, boots scuffing against the floor. The sound was small, but in the silence it cracked like thunder. Her chest clenched tighter. Were they losing patience? Did they think she couldn't handle it? She clenched her jaw and tuned it out. She had fixed worse. She had worked in storms, repaired equipment in rattling Humvees bouncing over dirt roads, replaced parts under blackout conditions. This wasn't new, but never before had the weight of so many eyes pinned her down. The lieutenant finally broke the silence. His voice was calm, measured. "Take your time, specialist. Do it right." It wasn't permission to relax, it was a reminder. In their world, mistakes killed. Half measures were worthless. She gave the faintest nod, her eyes never leaving the board. Inside her, two voices battled. One screamed with doubt. What if you fail? What if you're not good enough? The other, quieter but steadier, reminded her, you know this. You've done this 100 times. Machines don't lie. She chose the second. The minutes bled into each other. Her world narrowed until there was nothing but the radio's guts, the faint smell of ozone, and the hiss of her soldering iron. Everything else, SEALs, Lieutenant, mission faded. For those precious moments, it was just her and the machine. She recalibrated the frequency tuner, adjusting by millimeters, listening through her headset. Static roared in her ears, then dipped, then sharpened. She turned the dial slower, slower, until she caught the faint echo of a clean signal. It wasn't perfect yet, but it was close. Her heart kicked harder. Almost there. Behind her, the operators leaned forward, sensing movement. Their silence wasn't impatience anymore, it was anticipation. She adjusted once more, soldered the final joint, and locked the board into place. Her hands finally stilled. The hardest part was done. Now came the test. She reassembled the casing, fingers flying, screws clicking back into place. She pressed the power switch. For a second, nothing happened. Her stomach dropped. Then the light flickered. A hum, a sharp crackle of static. And then silence. Her breath hitched. She adjusted the dial, pressed transmit. Comms check. For half a second, the room seemed to hold its breath. Then a voice crackled back in her headset, crisp and clear. Copy. Receiving you loud and clear. Relief crashed over her, hot and heavy. She nearly sagged in her chair, but caught herself. Around her, the SEALs exchanged nods. No applause, no cheers, but in their world, that was approval enough. The lieutenant reached forward, lifted the unit, and tested it himself. When he heard the response, he gave a single sharp nod. Good work. 2 words. Simple. But in this room, from that man, they carried the weight of metals. She packed her tools quietly, hands steady now. The pressure was gone, replaced by a strange calm. She hadn't crumbled. She had carried the weight. As she walked out of the operations room, the mission clock resumed ticking. The SEALs moved with purpose again, and the exercise surged back on track. To them, it was another night of preparation. To her, it was something more. She had stood in the quiet fire of their scrutiny and come out unburned. She was no longer invisible. The room was heavy with expectation, and she knew it. Precision wasn't optional here, was demanded. If she faltered, even once, the SEALs would know. They weren't like the others. She usually worked for junior sailors who shrugged if something took a little longer, or officers who barely understood the difference between a circuit board and a battery pack. No, these men thrived on perfection. They demanded it from themselves, from each other, and tonight, from her. She spread her tools across the table in a neat line, each one placed with care. Screwdrivers, wire cutters, soldering iron, magnifying lens. It was ritual as much as necessity. The organization helped her think, helped her block out the noise in her head. She needed control, and this was how she claimed it, through order, through discipline. The lieutenant stood a few feet away, arms crossed, watching. He didn't say a word. His silence wasn't impatient. It was evaluative, the way a commander might watch his men on the firing line. His gaze wasn't unkind, but it carried weight, as if he were silently measuring her worth in this moment. She bent over the radio, unscrewing the back panel with slow, deliberate turns. The screws clinked softly against the table, each sound echoing in the stillness. As the casing lifted, the guts of the device revealed themselves tangled wires, scorched traces, dust from too many field exercises. To most, it looked like a mess. To her, it was a story waiting to be read. She pulled the magnifier closer and leaned in. Her eyes scanned every inch, tracing pathways, checking for breaks, scanning for the weak link. It was methodical work. Not fast, not flashy, but relentless. This was her battleground, and she approached it the same way SEALs approached a mission. No shortcuts, no hesitation. One of the SEALs shifted behind her, boots scraping faintly on the concrete. She didn't look up. Her concentration was a shield now. Every detail mattered. She stripped wires, checked continuity, recalibrated the frequency board. Each movement was precise, almost surgical. The room was silent, except for the faint hiss of the soldering iron as she set it to the board. A curl of smoke rose, sharp and metallic. She steadied her breathing, pressing the tip into the burnt trace, letting the solder flow in a clean silver line. One mistake, one slip, and she could make the problem worse. But her hands held steady, her training taking over where nerves threatened to intrude. She could feel their eyes on her back. It was more than observation. It was scrutiny. They weren't just watching her fix a machine. They were watching to see if she belonged in their world of precision and pressure. And though she wasn't one of them, not by rank or by training, she felt the unspoken challenge in their silence. Prove yourself. Her mind slipped into focus. It was the same focus she found late at night in the bay, when no one was watching, when it was just her and the hum of electronics. Time seemed to stretch, slowing until there was nothing but the board beneath her hands and the faint rhythm of her own breathing. She adjusted the coil alignment, listening through her headset. The first test came back fuzzy, static-laden. She didn't flinch. Instead, she made another adjustment, rotating by millimeters and listening again. Clearer now, but still not perfect. The lieutenant leaned closer. Progress? Close, she murmured, not lifting her eyes. Needs fine-tuning. He nodded, stepping back, giving her space. He understood, was the same in his world. Perfection came only through repetition, patience, and discipline. She worked faster now, confidence building with each adjustment. The repairs weren't just mechanical. They were personal. Every joint she soldered, every wire she reset was a statement. I am not invisible. I matter here. 10 minutes stretched into 20. Sweat gathered at her brow, sliding down to sting her eyes, but she ignored it. Her hands moved like clockwork. Strip, solder, recalibrate, test. Each step was deliberate, each one bringing her closer to the goal. The SEALs didn't break their silence. They didn't crowd her, didn't interrupt. But their stillness was its own form of pressure. These were men who had stormed compounds, swum rivers under fire, and dropped from the night sky into enemy territory. Yet here they stood, waiting for her, depending on her. The irony wasn't lost on her. The most dangerous men in the Navy were powerless without the steady hand of a technician hunched over a broken radio. Finally, she closed the casing, tightened the last screw, and set the unit upright. She pressed the power button. For a moment, nothing. Then the light flickered, steady and green. A faint hum filled the air. Her heart pounded. Almost there. She lifted the handset and pressed transmit. Comms check. Static hissed, then broke. A voice crackled through, sharp and unmistakable. Solid copy. Loud and clear. The room shifted. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Shoulders eased. Eyes softened. The tension cracked like a shell. She placed the unit back on the table, exhaling slowly. Her hands, steady through the entire ordeal, finally trembled. She tucked them into her lap to hide it. The lieutenant stepped forward, picking up the radio. He tested it himself, listening carefully, then gave a short nod. "Flawless," he said. It was one word, but it struck harder than applause. In this world, words were measured, deliberate. To hear that word from him was validation in its purest form. She closed her toolkit, each tool sliding into place with quiet finality. She didn't smile, didn't beam with pride. That wasn't her way. But inside, something shifted. The pressure had been immense, but she had endured. She hadn't just fixed a radio. She had proven, under the sharpest scrutiny, that she belonged. The SEALs returned to their preparations. The room alive again with the rhythm of straps clicking, weapons being checked, and last-minute adjustments. She faded back into the background, just as she always did. But this time, the silence around her wasn't indifference. It was respect. And respect, in this room, meant everything. The silence that followed the first clear transmission wasn't the silence of doubt anymore. It was something heavier, fuller. For the first time that night, the SEALs weren't staring through her. They were staring at her. The green light on the Kun's gear pulsed softly, steady as a heartbeat, filling the room with quiet proof of her success. She leaned back slightly, brushing a strand of hair from her damp forehead. Her breathing was measured, but inside her chest, her heart still hammered from the intensity. Hours of unseen training, nights hunched over circuit boards, and the weight of all those silent judgments had funneled into this single moment. And she had not failed. The lieutenant lifted the handset again, pressing it firmly against his ear. "Alpha 1, confirmed signal strength," he said, his voice even, almost clinical. A pause, then the reply came through crisp, undeniable. "Alpha 1 copies. 5 by 5. "Couldn't be clearer, sir." The lieutenant lowered the handset. For a moment, he simply stared at the radio, as though testing whether it would falter again. It didn't. The device hummed faithfully, ready to serve. Slowly, deliberately, he turned back toward her. Their eyes met. It wasn't the kind of look an officer gave an enlisted tech out of routine courtesy. It was sharper, heavier. A look that acknowledged her in a way she had never experienced before in her career. "Outstanding," he said quietly. The word was simple, but it landed with force. Around them, the team began to stir. Operators who had stood rigidly, arms crossed and jaws set, now unclenched. One man tested his earpiece again, grinning faintly as the sound came through flawlessly. Another clapped the shoulder of the teammate beside him, muttering something that drew the faintest laugh. The room's atmosphere, once suffocating, began to shift into something else entirely: confidence, relief, and just a spark of admiration. She packed her tools slowly, each one finding its place in the foam lining of her kit. She didn't rush. Precision mattered here too. Every click of metal against the case was deliberate, a reminder to herself that she hadn't survived this crucible by accident. Still, the awareness pressed on her. She was the only one in this room not built like a weapon. No hardened physique, no reputation carved through combat. She was small, quiet, a background figure in fatigues. Yet here she was, having solved a problem none of them could touch. And in that, there was a strange kind of power. The lieutenant set the Kun's unit on the center of the table, almost reverently. He stood straighter, his presence commanding without effort. Then, without warning, he reached out and extended his hand. She blinked. For a moment, she thought she'd misread it. Officers didn't usually do that. But his hand remained there, steady, waiting. She placed her hand in his. His grip was firm, professional, but not crushing. It was acknowledgement one professional to another, stripped of rank or role. "You saved our yacht tonight," he said evenly. "We don't forget that." The words struck harder than the handshake. Her throat tightened. She managed a nod, though her voice felt trapped somewhere in her chest. The SEALs began moving again, gathering gear, checking weapons, preparing to roll out for the training exercise. But the mood had shifted. The sharp edges of impatience and doubt had dulled. Now, when they glanced her way, their looks carried something she had never expected to see in this room. Respect. One of them, a broad-shouldered operator with a scar across his cheek, adjusted his earpiece and gave her the faintest grin. "Cleanest signal I've heard in weeks," he muttered. It was barely above a whisper, but it carried more weight than a dozen formal thanks. She nodded, unsure how else to respond. Praise from men like him wasn't given lightly. The lieutenant's voice cut through the low hum of activity. "Gear up." "We move in 5. Chairs scraped, straps tightened, weapons were slung across backs. The room shifted into controlled chaos, a storm of motion with purpose behind every movement. She stepped back toward the edge of the room, slipping into her usual role of quiet observer. Her work was done. Her place wasn't in the field. And yet, something inside her resisted fading completely into the background this time. She watched as the SEALs assembled, the repaired comms unit at the center of their coordination. It struck her then, without her, this operation would have faltered before it even began. They could be the strongest, fastest, deadliest men on base, but all of that would have been wasted without the simple, invisible tether of communication. And she had restored it. That realization rooted itself deep inside her. The lieutenant moved toward the door, his presence drawing the team with him. But just before stepping out, he glanced back once more. Their eyes met briefly. No words this time. Just a nod, a small, precise gesture. But it was more than enough. When the door closed behind them, the room fell into silence once more. She stood alone with her toolkit, the faint smell of solder still lingering in the air. For the first time in her career, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt earned. Her hands hovered over the kit before she finally closed it with a soft click. She exhaled, a long breath that seemed to empty the weight of the night from her chest. She wasn't a SEAL. She wasn't a combatant. But tonight, in this small, quiet way, she had proven herself on their stage. She flicked the lights off and stepped out of the room, her boots echoing softly against the corridor floor. The hum of the comms unit, steady and green, lingered in her mind like a beacon. For the first time, she didn't feel like just a technician in the background. She felt like part of something larger, something she could carry with her long after the night ended. The moment of success wasn't just in fixing the gear. It was in proving to them, and to herself, that she was more than her rank, more than her job title. She was essential, and that truth would never leave her. The training exercise had ended hours earlier, but the hangar still buzzed faintly with the echo of boots, voices, and the restless hum of cooling engines. She sat alone at her workstation, carefully wiping down her tools. The smell of oil, sweat, and faint traces of ozone still lingered in the air. It had been a long night. The SEALs had returned exhausted but satisfied, their operation carried out without a hitch. And though no one said it aloud, she knew her repairs had made it possible. Still, she didn't expect anything more. Recognition wasn't part of her job description. She was used to working in shadows, her contributions measured in silence rather than applause. The best she hoped for was that no one complained when the gear worked. But tonight felt different. There had been glances subtle but undeniable. The faint curve of a grin from a usually stone-faced operator, the almost casual good work, muttered by another as he passed her by. Small things, but in their world, those gestures were monumental. She was placing the last screwdriver into its slot when the door opened. The sound of boots struck the concrete, steady and deliberate. She looked up to see the SEAL lieutenant step inside. He wasn't in full kit anymore, though traces of the mission still clung to him. Dust on his boots, a streak of grime across his sleeve. His presence filled the room effortlessly. There was no mistaking his authority, the kind that didn't come from the silver bars on his chest, but from the way others seemed to straighten instinctively when he walked in. She rose halfway, unsure whether to stand at attention or remain seated. But before she could decide, he spoke. "Specialist," he said, his voice even low. "Yes, sir?" She replied quickly, her hands brushing against her fatigues. He walked toward the table, eyes scanning the neatly packed tools, the closed coms unit, the faint evidence of her work. He stopped just a few feet away, hands clasped loosely behind his back. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, without warning, he shifted his weight, drew himself upright, and raised his right hand in a crisp, flawless salute. The sound of it, his hand snapping to his brow, echoed louder than it should have in the empty hangar. She froze. It didn't make sense. Officers didn't salute enlisted personnel outside of formal ceremonies, and certainly not technicians tucked away in workshops. The gesture was so far out of the ordinary that her brain struggled to process it. Her instinct screamed at her to return the salute, but her arm hesitated halfway up, trembling slightly as though her body couldn't quite believe what was happening. For a heartbeat, the world shrank to just the two of them. No mission, no rank, no divide between elite warrior and quiet specialist. Just a single moment of acknowledgement, pure, unguarded respect. When she finally managed to complete the gesture, raising her hand to her brow, her breath caught in her chest. She held it, unsure how long the moment would last, unsure if she even wanted it to end. The lieutenant lowered his hand slowly, the motion as deliberate as the salute itself. His expression didn't shift much, but his eyes carried weight, a quiet intensity that spoke volumes. "You kept us in the fight tonight," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but every word landed with the gravity of a mission order. "That matters. More than you know." Her throat tightened. Words swelled up, but none seemed adequate. All she could manage was a quiet, "Yes, sir." He studied her for another moment before nodding once, sharply, as if sealing something unspoken between them. Then he turned and walked toward the door, his boots striking the floor with steady finality. But just as he reached the threshold, she realized the room wasn't as empty as she thought. Several SEALs lingered in the hallway outside, waiting to debrief. They had seen everything. Their eyes had widened at the sight, their commanding officer saluting a technician. Even for men hardened by combat, trained to expect the unexpected, this was something entirely outside their world of norms. None of them said a word. But their silence wasn't disbelief, it was reverence. As the lieutenant passed them, the operator straightened, as though subconsciously mirroring the respect they had just witnessed. And when their eyes flicked toward her, the shift was unmistakable. She wasn't invisible anymore. The door shut behind them, leaving her alone once again. She sank back onto her stool, her hands trembling as she pressed them into her lap. Her chest rose and fell, each breath heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. It hadn't been a medal, or a promotion, or even public praise. But it had been something far rarer, recognition stripped bare of ceremony or obligation. The salute hadn't been about her rank. It had been about her work, her precision, her ability to hold steady under scrutiny. It had been about the respect she had earned, not the role she filled. She exhaled slowly, a small smile breaking through the disbelief. The story of that salute would spread, she knew it. Word traveled fast in close-knit circles, especially when it involved something as unusual as a Navy SEAL lieutenant breaking protocol. But she didn't care about the whispers, or even the pride that would ripple through her fellow technicians when they heard. What mattered was what she carried in her chest now, the knowledge that her effort had been seen, valued, and honored in the simplest, most profound way. She closed her toolkit gently, her fingers brushing the cool metal as though it too had earned its place in this memory. Then she switched off the light, stepping into the quiet corridor with a steadiness in her stride she hadn't felt before. Tonight, she hadn't just repaired Cum's gear. She had rewritten what it meant to belong. And in the stillness of the night, that salute echoed louder than any words ever could. It wasn't the ordinary kind, the everyday pause between conversations, or the background hush of a late-night hangar. This silence was heavier, sharper. It clung to the air like smoke after a rifle shot, refusing to dissipate. The SEAL lieutenant's salute still lingered in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it. The crisp snap of his hand against his brow had been louder than the rumble of engines, louder than the shuffle of boots, louder than anything else that evening. Even now, minutes later, the echo of it seemed to vibrate in their ears. She sat, frozen on her stool, staring at the door that had just closed behind him. Her arms still tingled from returning the gesture, as though her very body hadn't caught up with what had just occurred. Across the hallway, the operators who had witnessed it exchanged glances. These were men trained to keep their composure, to remain stone-faced in firefights and unflinching under pressure. Yet now, they looked almost uncertain. Their commander had just shattered an unspoken rule of hierarchy. One of them, the scarred operator who had earlier complimented her repair, muttered under his breath, "No way, he just—" His words trailed, off, unfinished, because everyone already knew what he was trying to say. Another operator adjusted his gear slowly, deliberately, as though grounding himself in routine. But his eyes flicked toward the room again, toward her. They weren't mocking, nor dismissive. They carried something she had rarely seen from anyone. Outside her small circle of fellow technicians, respect. The silence deepened, stretching on until it became unbearable. Finally, the lieutenant's voice cut from down the hall. "Briefing room, now." The spell broke. Boots moved in unison, the team falling back into motion, their discipline snapping back like a taut rope. But as they passed, more than one set of eyes flicked toward her. Not with pity, not with curiosity, something quieter, harder to name, recognition. When the hallway emptied, she exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. Her hands trembled faintly, so she pressed them against the edge of the table until the shaking stilled. The salute had stunned her, yes. But what stunned her even more was the silence that followed. The silence of men who didn't question what they had seen, but instead absorbed it. Hours later, the story began to spread. In the mess hall, whispered voices carried between tables. "Did you hear what happened after the op?" The lieutenant saluted her. "No way. Dead serious. Ask Ramirez. He was right there." In the maintenance bay, another version circulated. Apparently she nailed the fix so flawlessly, the LT didn't know what else to do but throw a salute. Man, that never happens. Not from him. By dawn, the story had crossed sections of the base she had never even worked in. A supply clerk asked her quietly, "Is it true?" A young mechanic gave her a respectful nod as she passed. Even the Master Chief, who rarely spoke to anyone outside his chain of command, gave her a long, unreadable glance when he walked by her workbench. She didn't confirm anything. She didn't deny it either. The less she said, the less the moment risked becoming exaggerated or cheapened. For her, the truth wasn't in the retellings, it was in that brief silence, in the look in the lieutenant's eyes when he had raised his hand. Still, the ripple effect was undeniable. For years, she had lived in the shadows of the base's hierarchy. Her role had been invisible, essential yet unglamorous. She wasn't a SEAL, wasn't a pilot, wasn't one of the celebrated few whose names carried weight in stories passed around after hours. She was a technician, tucked into corners, fixing what others broke. Now, suddenly, her name was on people's lips. Not because she had sought it, not because she had demanded recognition, but because one man had chosen to break the silence in the most unconventional way possible, through a salute. That evening, she sat alone outside the barracks, the air cool and sharp against her skin. The stars overhead glittered faintly, scattered across the dark canvas of the sky. She hugged her jacket tighter and thought back to the moment again, replaying it in her mind. The silence wasn't just shock, it had been reverence. The kind of silence that falls when something sacred has happened, something outside the normal rhythm of military life. It reminded her of stories she'd heard as a recruit, moments when a commander had defied expectations to honor someone overlooked. She had always dismissed those as embellishments, tales polished by time, yet now she was living one. And still, a part of her wrestled with doubt. Did I really deserve it? Was it just a gesture in the heat of the moment? But another part of her, quieter and stronger, whispered back, "You held your ground. You delivered under pressure. You earned it." The silence in that room wasn't empty. It was filled with acknowledgement that could never be erased, no matter how many whispers followed. The next day, she reported to the Combs Bay, as usual. Her tools were exactly where she had left them, lined up neatly in their case. The broken radios still waited, the endless stream of work that defined her days. Nothing outwardly had changed. And yet, everything felt different. When the lieutenant passed by later that morning, he didn't stop. He didn't need to. A simple glance, a nod barely noticeable to anyone else, was enough. Between them, the silence still spoke louder than words. It was a silence that carried weight. A silence that told her, what you did mattered. What you are matters. For the rest of the base, it became a story to tell over meals, a tale that grew with each retelling. For her, it remained something else entirely. It was proof. Proof that in the unlikeliest of places, with nothing but her skill and her steadiness, she had carved a space of respect in a world that rarely granted it. And though the room had gone quiet that night, that silence had not been emptiness. It had been the sound of walls breaking, of barriers falling, of truth being recognized. A silence that she would carry with her always. Weeks passed, yet the memory of that night remained vivid in her mind. The base returned to its usual rhythm. Drills, maintenance checks, briefings, and the steady hum of preparation that never truly ended. To an outsider, life seemed unchanged. To her, everything had subtly shifted. Every glance from the SEALs now carried an unspoken acknowledgement. Not a showy salute, not a verbal commendation, but recognition in the way they moved, the way they responded in brief exchanges, the way their eyes softened for just a fraction of a second when she passed. Respect, quiet but palpable, had woven itself into the fabric of daily life. Her days were still filled with soldering irons, circuit boards, and field radios. No one gave her medals for late nights spent troubleshooting encryption modules. No one stood in the hangar clapping when she repaired yet another malfunctioning antenna. That wasn't her world. She wasn't on the mission. She was behind the scenes, in the shadows. But now, in those shadows, she moved differently. She carried herself with the awareness that her role mattered, that her skill, her precision, her steady hands under pressure had been witnessed and honored in a way that even the most formal accolades couldn't replicate. The lieutenant never repeated the salute, nor did he have to. Its impact had already been felt, etched into the memory of everyone who had seen it. But he did pass by her station more frequently, pausing just long enough to meet her gaze. It was a quiet acknowledgement, a nod that said, "I see you. I know what you carry." Stories of that salute began to ripple through the base, whispered in the mess hall, recounted in briefings, and shared in hushed tones among junior sailors. But each retelling carried embellishments. Sometimes his voice was louder. Sometimes the moment stretched longer. Sometimes she was described as a mythical figure who could repair anything in minutes. She never corrected them. The truth was simple, precise, and far more profound than any legend could convey. She had earned respect the way she had always worked through quiet, relentless skill. One evening, months later, she found herself back in the hangar, the familiar scent of solder and metal lingering. A new batch of operators was running through a communications drill. Radios buzzed, frequencies crackled, and the faint tension of coordination hung in the air. She watched them from the corner, checking a console, adjusting a calibration, repairing a minor fault before it could become a problem. One of the new SEALs glanced at her, eyebrows raised. "You're the comms tech from that night?" She offered a small, modest nod. "That's me." His eyes widened slightly. "Lieutenant saluted you." "I heard about it. Everyone's talking." She smiled faintly, but quietly, the way one does when pride is tempered by humility. "I just did my job," she said. But inside, she felt something she hadn't before. A deep, unshakable sense of belonging. She wasn't just doing a job anymore. She was part of a chain that carried lives, missions, and trust. And that chain had recognized her as vital, even if the world outside never knew. The memory of the salute returned, not as a moment of fleeting triumph, but as a lasting reminder. She remembered the crisp snap of the lieutenant's hand, the way his eyes locked with hers, the quiet reverence in the room. She remembered the silence that followed, heavy with acknowledgement, and how it had resonated across the base in the following days. It became a personal talisman, a symbol of what she had achieved quietly in the background for years. Every time she faced a malfunctioning radio, a critical timing failure, or the looming pressure of an impossible deadline, she thought of that salute. It reminded her that skill, discipline, and quiet persistence were more powerful than any noise, any ceremony, or any formal accolade. Her peers noticed the change in her demeanor, too. She carried herself with a confidence that didn't shout, but radiated steadily. Junior technicians began seeking her advice more openly, inspired by her precision and calm under pressure. Even seasoned sailors and officers, who had worked beside her for years, began to regard her as a cornerstone of reliability, someone whose judgment and skill could not be questioned. And the SEALs? Their respect became embedded in everyday interactions. When she handed a radio back after a repair, their nods were a silent acknowledgement of trust. When she briefed on signal integrity, they listened with the same seriousness they gave mission planning. The salute may have been a one-time gesture, but its impact endured, shaping how they regarded her long after the lights in the hangar had dimmed. She often reflected on that night quietly, sitting alone in the bay after hours, listening to the hum of equipment, feeling the weight of her hands on a soldering iron. She realized that the salute wasn't just recognition, it was affirmation. It told her, without fanfare, that her work mattered, that she had proven herself under scrutiny, that she was indispensable in her own way. And in that realization, she found something more, a sense of pride not tied to rank, medals, or accolades, but to integrity and mastery of her craft. She had faced pressure, silence, and doubt, and she had emerged respected not for who she was on paper, but for what she had done when it mattered most. Years later, when new personnel joined the base, they were told the story. The tale was shared not as a boast, but as a lesson in dedication, skill, and the quiet power of precision. And whenever someone asked her about it, she would smile softly, recounting the events with modesty, knowing that the real story lived in the hearts of those who had witnessed it, the SEAL lieutenant, the team, and herself. The salute remained with her, a small, lasting reminder. Not just of a single night, not just of recognition, but of the truth she carried every day, that even in the shadows, even in roles unseen and underappreciated by the world at large, excellence could command respect, and integrity could inspire awe. She returned to her workbench, picking up the soldering iron and lifting the headset for inspection. Radios needed care, circuits required attention, signals had to remain flawless. And as her hands moved with practiced precision, she felt the silent strength of that gesture behind her, guiding her, affirming her, reminding her that she belonged not in the spotlight, but at the heart of every mission. And in that quiet, steady way, she smiled. For she had learned something profound. The smallest acts of excellence could resonate far beyond the moment, reaching ears and hearts that even the loudest heroes could never touch. She was a technician, a specialist, but she was also essential. And that was a truth no silence, no protocol, and no shadow could ever take away.